Anybody who tries to correct the system from within is shot down because it doesn't make the politicians look good.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Welcome to episode 5 of Injustice for All. And today we're going to be very fortunate to have with us Serena Townsend, who was a former prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York, then the Inspector General for the entire New York City Department of Correction, and now in private practice. And Serena is going to help us understand why the Department of Correction, particularly here in New York City, has failed the people who are inmates. Why there have been to date 9 deaths this year alone at Rikers Island, the main correctional facility in New York City, because of the negligence or omissions or misconduct by guards. We're going to explore all that today, as well as a recent set of lawsuits that she filed accusing the New York City Police Department of corruption. But before we get to Serena, I'm reminded of my role here, which is as the late great representative from the state of Georgia, John Lewis, said, we're here to get into good trouble, necessary trouble, to explain to you how the system works, how the system has failed, and how we can hope to make it better. And along that line, it's hard to ignore what's going on with Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, she is, as most of you know, a woman who was involved with Jeffrey Epstein, Epstein was accused of misconduct with women under the age of 18, and that he would bring various people to engage in sexual activities with these young girls, both in Florida and in his private island that he owned in the Caribbean. And there have been many names floated about as having been part of that circle with Epstein. And Ghislaine was his assistant. Ghislaine comes from a very wealthy family. Her father was Robert Maxwell, who was a major media person in England. And she became involved with Epstein and ultimately had a relationship and stayed on. And she also was accused of facilitating Epstein's misconduct, for which she was prosecuted and convicted a few years ago and given a 20-year sentence. She's not eligible to come out of prison until approximately 2037. But because part of the red meat of a segment of the MAGA group was uncovering what happened in the conspiracy with Jeffrey Epstein. There are many from that political perspective that believe that there was a cover-up and that it was orchestrated by the Democratic Party. That may be, may not be, we'll find out. But that's been the cry: unseal all the documentation about Jeffrey Epstein, who hung himself in jail in, it's almost 6 years now, August 2019. And there have been questions about whether he actually hung himself or somebody killed him. And this is an ongoing discussion by people who believe that he may have been killed to silence him. There's no evidence of that, but there is purportedly a missing 1 minute from the videotape of the surveillance of his cell, and people will say that in that 1 minute something untoward occurred. One of the reasons that the criminal justice system doesn't work is because many who want to say bad things about it for political purposes do so, and we become inundated with that perspective. And the second is those who actually are in the system who want to undermine it for their own personal benefit. It could be putting people in a position of power to benefit them financially or otherwise, and therefore to benefit the person at the top. Now, with regard to Ghislaine, it seems to me that what we need to understand is what this process is all about. And part of the process in the criminal justice system is what we call cooperation. Cooperation is when someone who is engaged in misconduct themselves agrees to cooperate with the prosecutors and testify against others who were involved with them. Now, I've talked to you many times so far in our discussions about the manipulation of the system. This is yet another example of the manipulation of the system. So what happens typically is, and let's say we'll use a drug case for an example, a federal drug case. So a person gets arrested, they don't get bail initially, they go over to what we call in New York City the MDC, but that's true in every major urban center in America. There are local prisons that are associated with the federal government. Could be a contract facility, it could be a federal facility, but that's where they house the federal inmates. The person who's just been charged gets to the prison, and everybody in the prison says to him, I say everybody, most people in the prison will gather around, who are you? Why are you here? What are your charges? The person will ordinarily, because either they're afraid being in prison at the moment, or they're afraid of the other people who are there already, will say, I'm charged with blank. Everybody who's in a holding facility in every major urban center has become familiar with what we call the United States Sentencing Guidelines, which are the operative guidelines, grid for how people will be sentenced at the end of a case if found guilty. And so they will give advice to many of these people. Now we're talking right now as an example, a drug case, and they'll say, you're facing 20 years in prison, 30 years in prison. You should do what you can do to help yourself out. Don't hire a private attorney. Get legal aid or get the federal defenders. Don't pay for an attorney. You're wasting your money. You're going to get the same sentence with or without a private attorney. And so the person gets a court-appointed lawyer, and the court-appointed lawyer speaks to them for the first time and says you have options. You can cooperate with the government, or we can try to just enter a plea, or we can go to trial. And the person says, well, tell me why I should do one or the other. And almost uniformly, the attorneys appointed for these people will say, the best way to go is cooperate. You'll get a motion by the prosecutors to reduce your sentence, and you won't have to serve even the minimum mandatory time that the statute requires. And so they set up what's either called a proffer session or a reverse proffer session. A reverse proffer session is where the prosecutors will say, here's what we have against you. You should cooperate. A proffer session, by contrast, is the person coming in and saying, here's what I can offer you to cooperate. And in those conversations, what typically happens is the prosecutors ask about Jane or John or whoever they're interested in. And if the person responds, I don't really know Jane or John, the lawyer representing them will say, can you give us a few minutes and we'll meet with the client individually, privately, and we'll say to the client, if you don't give them what they need, you won't get the cooperation deal. So if you can help them with Jane or John, it will benefit you. By the time the discussion continues with the prosecutors, the person likely will know something about Jane or John that they think helps the prosecutors. Prosecutors never seek, and I'm talking about prosecutors and agents, never seek to corroborate the information that these people, cooperators, give them. They are willing, because it's what they want to hear, to rely upon that information to their detriment. So, I'll give you an example. There was a person who cooperated some years ago named Charles Williams, also known as Pootie, who was testifying against his brother, Brooks Davis. And Pootie got on the witness stand after telling the government prosecutors, I can tell you the date of this particular drug deal we did, and it was at this place on this time, and I'm certain of the date. And the prosecutors never made any effort to confirm or deny the facts as given to them. And by the time Pootie took the witness stand and said, I was with Brooks at this location, and I recall it because of this factor. So indeed, I had that case. Indeed, Brooks Davis was in prison at the time that his brother was describing him being in Harlem, engaging in a narcotic transaction. So when I cross-examined him, I said, you're sure about the date, and you're sure about the time, and give us as many details as you can. And he kept building it up, trying to show what a terrific recall he had of the transaction. And then I produced the evidence that he was not on the street at all and couldn't have been there, and it undermined the entire case. Now, this is true repeatedly because the agents and the prosecutors are only interested in hearing what they want to say. Now, with regard to Ghislaine, we've heard the news lately that the prosecutors now, the Department of Justice, wants to release the grand jury testimony of regarding Jeffrey Epstein. This is really just empty promises. One, even if they get it released, they don't need it released. They know what happened because the victims of Epstein all testified at Maxwell's trial. So there is trial testimony that will tell us what they need to know. There are reports that were created by the agents in creating the case against Maxwell and Epstein that are available, that you don't have to get a judge to unseal the grand jury minutes. But this is a deflection. And understandably, politicians continuously do this, not just Democrats or Republicans alone, but everyone who's in government at any level is looking for deflection to protect themselves. And in this case, everything that we're hearing in the press about the efforts of the Department of Justice to unseal and reveal everything about Epstein is just nonsense. And they should know it. Certainly, many of them have served in the Department of Justice or been assistant U.S. attorneys and know how it works. So, reports exist made by the agents that detail the interviews with the victims. There's trial testimony that shows what happened. There were civil lawsuits in which the victims testified when they sued Epstein. All that is available as part of the public record and could be just released, or we could be told, go look at that. Instead, we're being told about grand jury secrecy, and the grand jury minutes aren't going to help one way or another to tell us anything about who else was involved with Epstein. The grand jury is looking at the evidence against Epstein, and they'll be probably targeted only as against Epstein or Maxwell, as the case may be, and not about Prince Andrew or somebody else, because they weren't looking to prosecute them. And that's what a grand jury does. If you wanted to just have a report, which a grand jury can issue, then you would make a bigger investigation and you might get information about everyone who participated. But you're being misled by the Department of Justice right now as to why they're doing what they're doing. And in fact, the greatest misrepresentation of them all is that the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, is going to personally meet with Maxwell at the prison in Florida. Why? He didn't prosecute the case. Get the prosecutors who prosecuted the case or the agents who investigated the case to go see her. They know the facts. She can't probably mislead them at all. And no matter how Blanche thinks he'll get himself up to snuff about the facts, he'll never know them as well as those who prosecuted the case. But instead, it's a dog and pony show. We're being told, hey, the Deputy Attorney General is going to see her. And we'll talk to her about what happened. Now, remember this, the Department of Justice, back when she was prosecuted, said she's a liar. Now they want to say that she may be a truth teller. And what is her incentive to cooperate now? What can the Department of Justice offer her? She's been sentenced to 20 years in prison. So the only thing they can offer her is a commutation so that she gets out almost immediately, or a pardon. And if she's angling for either of those, how reliable can her account be? Is it to exonerate somebody? We don't know. But I thought it was worthy to understand how the system is being manipulated in front of you daily about this episode. In the same way, we have internally politicians manipulating the system, and that's one of the things that Serena Townsend will be talking to us about today. I talked recently with you all about how every 20 years or so we have to have a commission appointed since the 1930s to investigate the New York City Police Department, to expose the kind of corruption that has existed forever. Now, every time those commissions finish, corruption seems to die down for a little bit. And now we're in the midst of another episode of the revelations about the New York City Police Department being corrupt, and being corrupted at the highest levels. According to 5 lawsuits that were filed in the last 2 weeks in New York City, the police commissioner and the mayor of the city of New York and others engaged in an effort to create a New York City Police Department that was beholden to the mayor and which was operated by the mayor in violation of the people who were in office by firing them without cause, and with creating task force within the police department to reduce crime, but whom were committing misconduct themselves. So, as background, there used to be what we called an anti-crime force that would go around and do a lot of stop and frisk. Stop a person, frisk them, see if they had a weapon on them. They were over-aggressive, and particularly in minority areas. And after a federal lawsuit, the city said they wouldn't do that anymore. And they did away with the anti-crime unit. When Adams came into office, he decided that although he couldn't use the anti-crime unit anymore, he would create a new organization within the police department that would be overly aggressive. And to that end, he sought to implement it and make it essentially only responsible to him and to his cohorts who he put into the police department. It reminded me of a scene from a recent, I'm sure whether it was Netflix or Amazon show, in which the mayor of the city had his own task force only responding to him. Nonetheless, the people at the top of the police department who had been there 30, 35, 40 years objected to this and went to the police commissioner at the time, a woman named Sewell, who was considered to be a great choice to be the new police commissioner. And she was so upset about what she was learning that she went over to see Mayor Adams. And when she met with Mayor Adams, whatever was said in that meeting, by 4 o'clock that afternoon, she resigned from her position after less than a year in office. Adams then appointed one of his cohorts in this effort to reshape the police department in the image that Adams wanted. And that leads us to what Serena is going to be telling us about today. She represents 4 of the 5 chiefs from the New York City Police Department who have brought lawsuits. The 5th, Tom Donlin, was the acting police commissioner, and he also has made similar accusations against Mayor Adams and the top brass who Adams has appointed, that he's put people who he's friendly with into office at the highest levels, even though they're not qualified, and to carry out an agenda that's inconsistent with what we as citizens should believe the police department is doing or should be doing. So Tom Donlin is not one of the people who Serena represents, but he has filed his own lawsuit talking about how when he brought these issues to the mayor's attention, the mayor told him essentially to shut up and removed him from the position of police commissioner and appointed him as special advisor to the mayor. Now that the lawsuit has been filed, Adams is claiming that Donlin was mentally unfit to hold the office of police commissioner. And so the question is, if he was mentally unfit to hold the position of police commissioner, why did you make him a special advisor to yourself? Also, I wanted to come back to a theme we were discussing about the manipulation of the system with regard to victims. And it ties into the Maxwell case right now, because I went back and looked at documents relating to her prosecution. And I'm going to read to you from one of the public pronouncements by the Department of Justice. It says, if you believe you are a victim of Ghislaine Maxwell or have information about the allegations in the indictment, please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. This was on June 21, 2022. What I was trying to relate this to was our discussions a couple of episodes ago about how people are identified as victims or made into victims by the manipulation by the FBI and the prosecutors and the victims' witness assistance programs in the FBI. And this is particularly significant to me. In 2008, I had made a statement to the press in a case I was representing Roger Kahn in, the case I ultimately wound up being prosecuted for. And I said to the press who were gathered, I'm here in Guyana to find out anything and everything I can about the potential government witnesses and whether they were indeed victims, etc. By the time I got back to the United States after the trip, I was being accused by the government of misconduct for having intimidated potential witnesses by my comment, by mentioning it to the press. And yet, I see not the same standard for the prosecution. They can put out a public pronouncement and say, call 1-800-CALL FBI. I can't even say, as a private attorney, if you have any information, please contact us. So there's some of the dichotomy that exists within the system. So what I'm basically saying is that this is really theater. It's theater to persuade you one way or the other, depending on your political leanings or your views about the criminal justice system. But it means nothing. The system is tainted, corrupted, or corrosive, and nothing I say is necessarily going to change it. But if you listen to me and you think about what I'm saying and you think about what our guests are saying, you'll understand that there should be a groundswell at some point to try to change this before we go off the cliff completely. And we're pretty close to the cliff edge right now. Don't let yourselves be manipulated here as the agents and the prosecutors and those in politics are manipulating us. So now we're going to be joined by Serena Townsend, an attorney in New York City who was previously an assistant district attorney in the Kings County District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, New York, who was then in charge of, I'll say, internal affairs for the New York City Department of Correction. And as I said, she is now in private practice and is representing 4 very significant people with respect to the corruption allegations going on about the New York City Police Department. So welcome, Serena.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you.
How are you today?
I'm very well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Good. So I thought you were a terrific person to have join us because one of the significant desires I have for this program is to alert people, to educate people, and to hopefully motivate people into understanding why our criminal justice system and the justice system in general is failing, and how the foundations of the system are just falling apart, whether it's from political pressures, whether it's from just the people who are part of the system not caring or not making an effort to be all that they can be. So in that regard, let me give you an easy question. What's wrong with the New York City Department of Correction? Why do we have 9 deaths at Rikers Island this year alone? Why do we have guards who are not present at these locations? Why is it so difficult to get to Rikers Island and to see anybody, whether as a visitor, as an attorney? Why is it so hard to get them to court, for them to be in court for their court appearances, to get their cases resolved? And these are just easy questions. So tell us the
Yeah.
answer.
An easy question with a complicated answer, I think. You know, it is multifaceted, the dysfunction of the New York City Department of Correction. It's hard to boil it down to one small thing, but I think if I had to give you two big categories of problems, it's you're dealing with a difficult detainee population overall, not everybody, but overall, but you're even more so dealing with complete and utter mismanagement at the Department of Correction. Some of that mismanagement is the fault of the people who are working there currently, particularly in executive positions. But some of the mismanagement is because their hands are tied. It's kind of ironic. They're handcuffed because certain rules and laws that have accumulated over time, and even just a culture that has accumulated over time, really prevents reform and change. And I know, I'm sure, Robert, we're going to go into talking about receivership a little bit later, because that's on the brink, and why I think it might actually help the system improve. But to answer your question, those are the pressing issues. You have mismanagement, you have incompetence, and then you have things that really can't be fixed the way that they are right now without extreme intervention.
So it might be helpful for those listening to know about your stay at the New York City Department of Correction. And
Yeah.
if I'm correct, you were ultimately fired.
Yes, you are correct.
For being or making an effort to hold the guards accountable to the standards for which they were hired. So tell us about
Right.
that.
Yeah, of course. So I started at the New York City Department of Correction in September of 2016. That was after I spent what I felt was a whole career at the Brooklyn DA's office. I was a deputy bureau chief over there. I had worked there for 10 years. I had prosecuted crime extensively throughout Brooklyn. I came to the Department of Correction in order to help bring them into compliance with the Nunez consent decree. The Nunez consent decree came about because of too much excessive use of force by the officers over there and a desire to improve conditions and transparency over in the department. So it was my job to investigate and discipline staff at the Department of Correction. So you're right. It was basically internal affairs and staff discipline over there. And ultimately, we were getting better with respect to the timeliness of our investigations and the accountability that we were meting out. We were doing better with respect to the fairness of the investigations themselves, because they had found that the investigations were very biased before I got there, imbalanced, unfinished, if you will. And so we were inching closer and closer towards compliance. In fact, we even got into compliance in certain of those categories. And then what ended up happening was Mayor Adams was elected, and he put in a commissioner named Louis Molina, who was a friend of his and somebody who used to work actually also at the Brooklyn DA's office as an investigator, and previous to that with the NYPD. And essentially, what we went from having reform-minded commissioners, people who were very much in tune with trying to fix the department and aligned with the consent decree, and instead we ended up getting Louis Molina, who was very much in bed with the unions. Again, I'm not anti-union, but some of the actions of the police unions and the corrections unions is very concerning, and oftentimes acted as a very strong barrier to both reform and accountability. And what ended up happening was I had a meeting with Mr. Molina about 2 weeks before he took the seat. It was late December of 2021. And in that meeting, we discussed a bunch of things, including, the cases that were pending and the investigations that were ongoing and the discipline of officers. And in that conversation, he essentially said, what can we do to get rid of these cases? How are you going to get rid of 2,000 disciplinary cases in my first 100 days? Which to me was alarming. It showed that he really didn't understand the disciplinary process. I can't get rid of cases. I can't, right? These are cases that were investigated, substantiated, and now had to go through due process. It sounded like he just wanted some sort of talking point to appease the unions, especially with that deadline of my first 100 days. It just sounded like he was trying to have a speech prepared for himself of all of his successes. And so I tried to explain to him what the process entailed and how it was not possible. Ultimately, he said, essentially, what can you do to just get rid of him, though? What's the lowest we could offer? What's the, bare minimum that you could do to just get him off the docket? And I said, well, you're basically asking me to dismiss these cases because I can't force people to sign off on a disposition. They have the right to go to trial. They have a right to a defense. And I explained over and over, and all he kept saying was, how are you going to get rid of 2,000 cases in my first 100 days? So I refused to do it. I tried to work around it. And next thing I knew, on his first day of being the commissioner officially, January 3rd of 2022, I was called down to HR and I was terminated.
Well, I would say that this is a unique setting, but unfortunately, in the 50 plus years I've been around, it's the norm. Anybody who tries to correct the system from within is shot down because it doesn't make the politicians look good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I think I was pretty naive in those first days. I was like, oh, I'm a do-gooder. Everything's going to be fine. If in the past, if I was good at my job, I got rewarded for that. I was the first to be promoted throughout the system at the DA's office. My good work was recognized there. And I naively thought that that's what would happen at DOC also. Plus, I was written into a court order by the judge overseeing that consent decree saying that I could not be fired unless there was a bona fide reason. And so I was feeling pretty safe, which was silly of me to feel. The unions got into Commissioner Molina's head, I guess, and he just decided to do what he did. But as you're seeing, after that, you're seeing, and this is going to obviously lead up to the individuals that I am representing currently, but you've been seeing the acts of this mayor and his commissioners and the people that he appoints to his inner circle. So in a way, I felt very comforted in kind of this strange way by all of the corruption that ensued after I was terminated, because I was like, okay, it's not just me. This is just an unbelievably corrupt mayor and the executives that he put into office.
So the city council and the prior mayor had signed off on an arrangement where Rikers Island, the principal location to house inmates, pre-trial and sometimes post-trial, in the city of New York, was to be closed and there to be individual community prisons housing less people in at least 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City. What's happened with that?
It's unfortunate. The law says that that Rikers has to be closed by 2027. There's absolutely no way that that's going to happen. I think Mayor Adams tried to pitter patter around that for the first couple of years that he was in office, and now he just flat out admits that there's no way that schedule is being met. The biggest problem is that up until Mayor Adams took office, the population numbers were going down on Rikers. There was a concerted effort to decarcerate. And, there's a lot of people saying out there that, crime has gotten worse. And, of course, they're going to have to put more people onto Rikers. But the correlation, if you really look at the data, really was not there. It had nothing to do with the people who were released or who weren't, or bail was not really set on them. And so there was this effort to reduce the population so that there could be the opportunity to close Rikers and fit the number of people into those borough-based jails. I think it had to go down to something around like between 4,000 and 5,000. And there was progress there. I think it was between 5,000 and 6,000 before Mayor Adams took over, and now it's back up to, I think, like in the 7,000s. So once he took over, things changed, and more people were now housed on Rikers, and it's just that much harder to move people off of Rikers when there are too many. I mean, there's simply just not enough beds, there's not enough of a capacity to hold people in those borough-based jails. So it simply cannot be closed on time.
I think people don't understand what's involved in actually getting someone from Rikers, who's an inmate there, to a court appearance. So, can you describe the process? How early in the morning do these individuals have to be awakened? How do they get to prison, from prison to the courthouses? And at the same time, maybe you can talk to us about the guards situation at Rikers Island.
Yeah. So interestingly, there's a statistic on this. Before Mayor Adams took over, people were making it to their court dates about between 97 and 99% of the time. Once Commissioner Molina took over, it dipped into the 80%, into the 80s. And so people were not even getting to court. The process is onerous. Essentially, they have to be woken up like 4 or 5 in the morning. I mean, really unbelievably early in the morning. And the reason for that is because it just takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to actually have the right amount of correction officers available to escort each of these individuals from their cells to the bus. We see an increase of uses of force when these things happen, just to get somebody from their cell to the bus. There's always going to be, the opportunity for more force. There's always going to be opportunity for more contraband to be moved. It's in general a dangerous event. And so a lot of precautions need to take place, which leads to delays. It leads to, and of course, people are angry when they have to go to court. They don't want to wake up that early. They don't want to face a judge and hear bad news. They don't want to be reminded of the case. They don't want to go to trial when they're on trial because it's scary and this is like the end of the road for them. And so there's all of these opportunities when you have to move a person from their cell to the bus to get to court. That takes a very long time and it adds a lot of stress to the situation. Now you have to also deal with the fact that a lot of times people call out sick, guards call out sick, they're not there. Mismanagement, leads to unmanned posts. And so now how are we going to find a substitute to get somebody from one place to another? It's a whole big mess. I think one of the things that the borough-based jails brings to the table, and I'm not saying borough-based jails is the perfect solution, but one thing that it does cure is this insanity of having to wake up so early, having to move people from one place to another, get on a bus, which is also unsafe for the drivers of that bus, by the way. We've had, slashings happen on buses and uses of force as well. So it's a volatile situation to get people from, place A to place B.
Well, it's disturbing to hear you say that there are slashings that may occur of the correction personnel on the bus. So you would ask yourselves, weren't those inmates searched before they got on the bus?
Yes. That's another issue, right? I mean, it's a mixture, and it goes right back to what I said at the start of the podcast, which is it's a mixture between, there's plenty of people who are detained on Rikers who are not violent and who are just trying to get their day in court, who are just trying to get through the experience of being put through the system. And then there are people who are dangerous on Rikers Island. We cannot ignore that. There are plenty of gang members and plenty of people who know how to, secrete weapons into their body cavities without officers knowing. And then on the flip side, you do have mismanagement or people who are lazy, like you mentioned before. So it's not a perfect situation. You don't have a perfect detainee and you don't have a perfect CO. And the second you have two imperfect people, interacting at the same time, that's when you have the dangerous situation. I will give credit to, the bus drivers, the transportation division in general, because if you think about the volume of people that they have to move back and forth, and comparatively speaking, the minimal number of disasters that happen on those buses, they should be credited for that. But and it's a dangerous situation though, because it could go south at any point.
Right. So for those who listen and don't know where Rikers Island is located, it's a little island near LaGuardia Airport in New York City. Theoretically, that's under the jurisdiction of the Bronx, but really is in Queens.
Yeah.
And to get to it and back is a single bridge, the Frank Bono Bridge, and which makes it very difficult to transport people or to have transportation across the bridge. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's one of those, it's kind of creepy. It's a daunting trip. It's a daunting bridge. And I think people, internalize that stress, both the staff and the detainees going over that bridge. It's, everyone talks about going over that bridge. It's a long bridge. Sometimes we get coyotes on the bridge. It's really strange, but there are sometimes coyotes roaming around Rikers. And so, yeah, it's one bridge. It's hard. And one commissioner that I used to work for, Commissioner Brand, she used to say it's an entire city on that island. You have to bring enough food, onto the island to feed everybody. You have to have sanitation, take all of the garbage out. It's really its own small city on that island, and it is difficult to navigate. It's also very difficult for visitors to visit the people, their loved ones who are incarcerated there.
Well, as a postscript, about the bridge, it's named after Frank Bono, and who was the supervising warden of the facility in the 1970s. And I began as a prosecutor to investigate the Department of Correction, and had finally gathered enough evidence that I thought warranted subpoenaing Warden Bono because of his conduct. And he was to be brought into the grand jury the next day for his testimony about these alleged acts of misconduct. And he had a heart attack that night and passed away and never got to the grand jury the next day. In the days that followed, every politician in the city of New York talked glowingly about who he was and what he had meant to the city. By contrast, I was sitting at my desk knowing what he had done for the city and what he should have been investigated for. Nonetheless, to celebrate who he was, in my view, someone who I believed had committed misconduct, I found it shocking that they named the bridge that connected Rikers to the mainland after him. But wow. Here it is, 50-something years later, and that's still the testament to Frank Bono.
What a story!
Yeah.
My God.
We have an issue with the guards at Rikers, right? Understaffing, you mentioned. Tell us about that.
Sure. A lot of it has to do with mismanagement. There's the staffing numbers have been a topic of argument and debate for many, many years, actually. You have people on one side saying that it's the most richly staffed jail in the country, which I believe it is if you look at the ratio. I believe at one point it was over 1-to-1 ratio, like a 1.3 or 1.4 guards to one inmate.
Right. So for every guard, for every inmate, there's essentially a guard that's assigned there.
Correct. So you have people, and if you look at other jail systems, that ratio is much lower. And then on the other side of that argument, people say, including union, they say, look, you can't look at it that way. That's too simplistic because we have different tours, we have different shifts. So really 1-to-1 is not 1-to-1 because you don't have one guard, for example, working 24 hours. So you can't say that that's true. The jail is open 24/7. And so you really need more than just a 1-to-1 ratio. But then you just go back to the original argument and say, but how come other jails can do it with less? So there is this back and forth. And the people who say the jail is richly staffed, they have a point because until and unless management can properly staff the jail, you really don't have a great leg to stand on saying that you need more staff, because you do see that there's a ton of uniformed officers who join the department and don't want a jail. They don't want a jail. They want to be in an office. They want to answer phones. They want to drive captains and, executives around in their cars. They want to put together PowerPoints for like a data strategy unit. They want to do construction, which is fine. It's not that that can't happen, but you can't say that you have X number of uniformed staff and then not put them in the jails and then claim that you don't have enough staff. There are plenty of civilians who could do the construction. There's plenty of civilians who can do data collection, who could do investigations, who can do all of those things. By the way, having run investigations, I think it's imperative to have some correction officers in your investigative unit. I do think it's important to have that mix. But my point is, you don't have to have so many officers in civilian, roles when the jails are understaffed. And then even when you do have them in the jails, a lot of times they're just not putting the right people in the right places. And so it causes a huge problem.
So about how many officers that are assigned to Rikers are part of the sick out that occur on a daily basis? That is, don't show up and claim they're sick.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I actually think out of all of the things that were really, really bad a few years ago, that's the one thing that did improve. Interestingly, I think there's plenty of people, like the investigations must still continue with respect to people who call out sick and aren't actually sick. But I will say back in 2020, 2021, 2022, after COVID hit, there were people who were genuinely in need of, not being there. There were genuinely sick people, but then there were a ton of people who were taking real advantage of COVID and blaming COVID for their absence when they were not sick. I myself oversaw plenty of those investigations where, they were vacationing, they were partying, they were doing plenty of things where it was clear that they were not sick. The thing though that happened was, we instituted a very strict accountability system for that purpose. And unfortunately, after some time, when the issue was kind of abated, that very strict, oversight system started punishing the wrong people, started punishing people who were actually sick. And so, I do think that there needs to be somebody to oversee that system again, who could rejigger it, who can really look at what's going on, because I do think that people learned their lesson. I actually think it's the one thing that worked. I think people were coming back to work after they saw, the extreme punishments that were happening to those who were faking. And I do think that people are still calling out sick, but not to the extent that they were back in the day.
And when you say back in the day, you're talking maybe
COVID time
and thereafter.
Yeah.
So within the last couple of years, things are starting to get back to normal, but there was like almost a 30% sick out rate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was crazy. Yeah, that was a really, really big problem, for staff that were all, there already wasn't enough staff there.
And there's, because of a union contract, you can't fire somebody for being out sick, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of, look, everybody's entitled to due process, but the due process takes a lot of time. And it's frustrating when people are doing the wrong thing and you can prove it really fast, but you have to wait, a year to get them fired.
So Rikers is not going to close in 2027 as directed and mandated.
Correct.
So what happens then?
Yeah, what happens indeed. I think, the problem with that is once you pass a deadline, once it's over, there's like no urgency whatsoever if there's no accountability for it. Everybody wants to meet the deadline. And if they think they're going to be held accountable for not meeting that deadline, then they try to rush and make it happen. At this point, it's been clear that everybody's just basically thrown up their hands and said like, oh, well, it's not going to happen. And once that deadline is passed, I do fear that there's not going to be a sense of urgency at all to make things happen, to, close the jail or make it better. So I think we're going to be in for a little bit of an issue there.
So in the last few years, there's been a lawsuit filed in the federal court trying to take away control of the New York City Department of Correction from New York City, and to have federal oversight. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You know I can. I know it front to back. Yes. So essentially, with all of the constitutional violations that have not been abated for the longest period of time, and the data showing that actually the Department of Correction is performing worse today, including with respect to excessive use of force, worse today than they were when the consent decree was even put in effect, which was back in like 2014. That in and of itself is evidence that New York City is incapable of bringing the jails into constitutional levels of operation. And so what ended up happening was, yes, the plaintiffs in the Nunez case, that includes, legal aid, and the DOJ steps in, they come in and they say, look, for years we've been trying to fix this and hold them accountable. And there's literal specific categories of noncompliance where they've never improved. There's no sign that they will ever improve, and they've constantly been a disappointment. There's a federal monitor, Steve Martin, and a deputy federal monitor, Anna Friedberg, and they have a small team, and they have been monitoring and reporting back to the judge for all of these years, all of the problems on Rikers, and they've done so very extensively. And yet the department has not been able to do what they need to do to fix the problems that the monitor has addressed over and over and over again. And the monitor's data is black and white. Like they go in and they know what they're doing, and they really try to explain, this is the problem, here's how we can fix it. And in my experience working with them, they've been very hands-on and very understanding with respect to how things need to be and how things can be. At a certain point in time, though, you have to just say, look, it's not working. No matter how many times you say you're going to fix it, it's not fixable. So yes, a federal receiver is now being considered. Actually, the judge just received applications, from what I understand, just earlier this week from candidates who want to be the federal receiver. The receiver is essentially a person. It's not, this misconception that some people have that the feds are taking over. It doesn't mean that, the Federal Bureau of Prisons takes over. It doesn't mean that federal guards are taking over. It basically means that there's going to be one person called a remediation manager, is what the judge is calling it, who's going to oversee Rikers and report not to the mayor, but to the judge, report to the court, to the federal court. That's why it's a federal receivership. And so this person is going to have the capability to do things that a commissioner has not been able to do. They have and we could talk about that more, but basically they're given superpowers to be able to fix certain things that the city has not been able to fix.
Such as to avoid the union contract.
One of the things that they could do, yes, is to, check out that contract and see where it does and doesn't make sense and try to make changes there. They can make changes with respect to the accountability system, how people are held accountable, what due process looks like, how investigations are handled. They look at budgets, how things can get paid for and procured. They look at staffing, hiring, firing, promotions, stuff like that. Every single thing that touches the categories of excessive use of force.
And just as a footnote to what you're saying, it costs the city of New York approximately $150,000 plus per inmate to house them at Rikers, right?
Robert, I think I heard somewhere that it was $500,000 to house somebody for a year. That's what I heard, that it was $500,000. I think Brad Lander, as controller, did that calculation, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it's $500,000 per detainee per year.
Well, seems like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you could pay 5 guards that amount of money, right, for their yearly salary. It's crazy. It really is an obscene amount of money. And I do think a receiver who comes in, who's going to have hopefully a budgetary team, because the receiver is going to have a team. They're not going to be alone. Has to look at that.
I have endless respect for the federal judge, Judge Swain, who's handling this matter. But it has taken a long time, even in her courtroom, to get to the point where she's looking for people to apply for the job. Well, why is that?
You know, you make a very fair point, and I completely agree that I also have a ton of respect for Judge Swain. She has been, it's with all of the craziness going back and forth between the parties, she has been the one, calm and consistent voice. I think because she's a judge and she's the chief judge at that, she's very concerned with making a proper record. She doesn't want to make a decision, especially one this aggressive, this rare, and then be overturned. She wants to protect her record. She doesn't want to be appealed successfully. And I respect that. Others will say, and a lot of people have said, look, there's no time to waste. People are dying. This is an emergency situation, and they're not wrong. I think that she struck as best a balance as possible between trying to expedite things without, steamrolling it to the extent that somebody somewhere could have an argument that she, made a knee-jerk reaction that was not well-founded on evidence and law. I think, that's why it took some time.
And how much does Steve Martin and the monitors that she appointed, Judge Swain appointed them,
yes.
How much do they get paid every year?
I don't know. I think they get paid a decent amount of money. I haven't seen their contract, but I think they do get paid a good amount of money. And, I think a concern, of course, is how much is it going to cost for the receivership too? Because as you mentioned, it's just there's so much money being thrown at all of these things. And I think it's so important for somebody to be able to say, look, it may be expensive, but it's going to get fixed. You're going to be investing in a solution, not wasting money.
Well, to the credit of the new federal director of the Bureau of Prisons, he hired as a deputy director a former inmate to help him oversee the changes that needed to be made in the federal system. We'll see how that works out. But a federal receiver who has never really had a client at Rikers Island may not be the most appropriate person to be the federal receiver, no matter how acclaimed they are as an attorney.
I totally agree with that, Robert. I think a lot of people are clamoring for the position who may not have the goods. I do think that either the receiver or people on their team need to have some idea of what goes on at Rikers. Now, the judge made it pretty clear, and I understand why she did, that she doesn't want the receiver necessarily to be somebody who only has experience with Rikers, because, of course, that's you want somebody with different perspectives. You want somebody who can bring something new to the table, who's not just kind of brainwashed with the way Rikers is and nothing else. At the same time, I think whoever ends up being the receiver absolutely needs to form a team or have at least one or two people on that team who knows Rikers, who could understand the culture and understand, why things aren't working before figuring out how to fix those broken things.
Well, maybe, as you say, having experience beyond Rikers is important, but if you look at the federal system, it's similarly broken. So I don't know that experience adds much to the equation. But yeah. I agree. There ought to be a team that has people who know Rikers, who know what has to be fixed in order to fix it.
Yeah. I mean, listen, when I came to DOC, okay, I was a New York City prosecutor for 10 years. I put people on Rikers. I argued for bail. I argued for remand. And the truth of the matter is, when I joined DOC, I thought I knew pretty much how it ran because of the fact that, at least in an ancillary capacity, I worked with Rikers. I have to tell you, Robert, it is so niche. It is so unique. You simply cannot know Rikers unless you've worked Rikers. You just can't. And when I got there, before I made any changes, people wanted to see me make big changes fast. They were like, oh, new person in here. What's she going to do? And I told people, I said, I am not making changes until I learn this place. And I did a crash course. I learned every single thing that I could. I learned where things were working, where it wasn't working before I made changes. And that's the only reason why I had any success over there, because I really dug deep. I met with, executives all the way down to, the first, second, third year investigators who worked for me. And I said, what's not working? What needs to be fixed? That's the only way you're going to be able to fix it. And Robert, to your point, you can't learn that fast enough. You have to learn it. And it's got to be, you got to do it, which is why I say, as much as we want somebody with other experience and we need somebody with other experience, you absolutely need people to train that person, train them up quick, because you have to learn it before you make those changes.
Before we run out of time in today's segment, I wanted to turn to your representation of 4 former chiefs in the New York City Police Department. Tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, that is just one example or 4 examples of the corruption within Mayor Adams's inner circle. Essentially, what you're seeing is you had 4 very decorated, very well-respected chiefs and assistant chiefs who worked for the NYPD for between 30 and 40 years. We're not talking about even the ones who work for 20, which is very respectable. 20 and out is what they'll say sometimes. No, these are people who cared so much about the city and about the NYPD and rose up in their ranks for decades and wanted to stay even when they could leave. And what each of them did was they noticed really corrupt things happening and they voiced their concerns. And after they voiced their concerns numerous times, they were pushed out or demoted or told essentially, you're rubber roomed. And so basically, I'm representing them because they were retaliated against for being whistleblowers within the New York City Police Department.
So one of the most interesting of those individuals, and I think you represent Chief Pontillo.
Yes.
McCormick, Veneziano.
Yeah. Yep.
And Essig, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So one of the most interesting of the stories that is related in the complaints, and by the way, why did you bring it in state court versus federal court?
Well, we had to really figure out what the proper claim was here. And we also had a statute of limitations that we had to look into. And we also wanted to make sure that, there's a lot of strategy there, but essentially we felt very strongly about this particular whistleblower claim, which was proper in state court. And so, we had exactly the elements that we needed to make that claim out. We didn't want to overblow it. We didn't want to exaggerate it. We wanted to say what it was for what it was.
One of the things I mentioned in advance of your getting on screen was the whole issue with the anti-crime unit and the new unit that has replaced it. That's part of the complaints that you've made in the lawsuit. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah. So a lot of times what we see, especially in this administration, is the same old, but with a different name, right? You have the same, units acting inappropriately, but they slap a new name on it and they think that it's going to convince people that they're acting differently. So I think you're probably referencing Pontillo's claim. He essentially had to work with, as we mentioned earlier, a federal monitor, but this is a different federal monitor. This is the NYPD's federal monitor. It was his job essentially to be an integrity arm of the department. He had to audit certain things that were happening within the department in accordance to their consent decree, and to work with the federal monitor essentially to say what things were happening that were good, what things were happening that were concerning. And really, he was one of those guys who wanted to try to make things better, who wanted to abate the issues, who wanted to address things before it became really problematic. So what he was seeing is some of these teams acting very inappropriately, not using body-worn cameras when they were supposed to. We see that sometimes where you should activate your body-worn camera at a certain point in time, but it's pretty convenient for, the officer to forget to put it on during the time when they were acting inappropriately and only put it on later on down the road when it benefits them. So he was seeing manipulation of body-worn cameras. He was seeing kind of a rise in car chases which if you've been following the news in the last couple of years, you know, they're kind of back in the headlines, whereas they weren't for a while. You know, deadly car chases by the police. He was alerting people to those kinds of things, problematic stops and frisks, things like that. And ultimately, that was his demise. So he brought that up in meetings, and you know, Mayor Adams's people did not want to hear about that, and Mayor Adams himself did not want that exposed. And next thing you know, Pontillo is, you know, put out to dry.
Well, they all basically have a similar story.
Yes.
Of the conduct, and that there are cronies of the mayor, including Chief Madry, who have put their stamp on the police department. That's Adam's stamp, not the members of the police department who theoretically have earned their wings and risen to the top of the department.
That's right. I mean, you basically see in two of the complaints in particular, that would be McCormick and Essig's complaint, you see cronies of Mayor Adams and Mayor Adams's people getting placed completely inappropriately into certain positions. Now, we all know that sometimes things like that happen in all areas, not just NYPD. We know friends of friends get placed, family members get placed, but this was different because of the volume of people who were getting placed inappropriately and the severe lack of experience that those people had, and the importance of the units that they were going to. So special victims, which really requires, you know, a very specific type of person, specific levels of training and experience before you go into a unit like that. You know, financial units, the El Dorado unit, which handles, you know, money laundering, units where you had to work hand in hand with the feds. I mean, these are like the honor roll people. You know, these are supposed to be, these aren't just, oh, I just want a cushy job where I don't have to do much and I could like sit behind a desk. These are jobs that actually required specific expertise, and people were being placed there without any of those credentials.
It is extraordinary, but consistent with the way the police department and here and elsewhere operate. And just to put a dot on one of the I's here, I know that they went to Police Commissioner Sewell, the woman who was selected by Adams initially and who was considered by most a great choice.
Yeah.
I know that she went to Adams to register these complaints and resigned after that meeting.
Yeah. That to me, when I learned about that timeline in particular, it was very disturbing to me, because as I think people noticed, former Commissioner Sewell, she really didn't go around in the press much. She didn't make a lot of statements. She really kept it quiet, and very respectable. And, you know, it did seem like she very much tried to do the right thing while she was there, and tried very, very hard to kind of allay the issues, even when she was being stonewalled. And I don't know, you know, time will tell, discovery in this case will tell what exactly happened in that meeting. Because to me, the timing cannot be a coincidence that she registered, as you said, those complaints, and then basically immediately after that stepped down.
And from the lawsuits, what happens after she steps down is that all four of your clients no longer had protection.
That's right. That's right.
And that's how they wound up. And what Adams did, what the police department did to them was, we're going to demote you essentially 5 ranks to the rank of captain, reduce your income by $40,000 or so, and impact your pension, or resign.
Yeah. We like to call that constructive termination because nobody would take that. I mean, you have such people who are decorated chiefs to be demoted 5 ranks. I mean, it's just, they do it on purpose. That's how they get you to walk away and then claim, oh, you just resigned or you retired. We didn't terminate you.
Well,
but it's everybody could see through it.
We're going to have you back to talk more about the Department of Correction and certainly about these lawsuits. I thank you so much for being with us today. And
thank you, Robert.
And we'll see you soon. Be well.
I really appreciate it. The conversation with you is always a good one. Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Talk soon.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you so much for being with us today for episode 5 of Injustice for All, and hopefully you'll join us next week. We're going to have an interesting topic then as well.